How is the Bell X-2 rocket plane, the airship Hindenburg, a United Airlines Caravelle, and the artist who painted this painting all connected? It's an amazing story, and we're going to share it with you on Celebrating Aviation with Mike Mashat. What these four aviation entities have in common is that they're all connected to amazing stories and coincidences. There's a saying, certain aviation phenomena simply cannot be explained. For starters, let's talk about the Edwards Air Force Base Air Show I attended last week. This is now October 2022. I went with my wife, Sherry, and my younger daughter, Sarah. We had a wonderful day up there. It was a spectacular air show. The finale, as always, is the Thunderbirds, Air Force Aerial Demonstration Team. And as they opened the show, Sherry happened to snap the opening diamond formation pass with her iPhone. Now, I know you're all looking at the airplanes. It's a really tight formation, one of the best Thunderbirds performances I'd ever seen. But look over at the right side of the photograph. There's a cloud that's just forming, and it looks amazingly like an F-16. Full disclosure, I did a bit of color balance to the photograph. I did not touch the edges of that cloud. That's what we saw. Timing, unbelievable. Now, speaking of Edwards, raise your hand if you recognize this scene. It's the opening to a movie. It's our first story, and it's the film Toward the Unknown, 1956. The story of Edwards Air Force Base and the flight test programs happening at that time. Just an amazing film, opened in the summer of 1956. And gosh, look at the copy, the rocket pilots of outer space and their experimental craft that rule the skies beyond the sky. Really? Lincoln Bond, hottest of them all, so hot he burned everyone he touched. Well, it's an incredible film. It's based on the career of the gentleman you see here in the flight suit, Lieutenant Colonel Pete Everest, who was chief of flight test at that time. And much of the storyline is modeled on his experiences. He's seen here after the first powered flight of the Bell X-2 in November of 1955, and he's staring at a small hole that was burned in the base of the vertical stabilizer as a result of that flight. But it's significant because the airplane was grounded for the next 4 months. They worked on repairs and updates to the machine and modifications to the engines. So the airplane didn't fly again until late March of 56. What's significant is the movie Toward the Unknown was filmed on location at Edwards from January to early March 1956. Here are the three stars of the movie. I say three because you have William Holden on the ladder, Lloyd Nolan on the left side of the airplane, and the Bell X-2 on its ground handling dolly. But what was really amazing about the movie is it wasn't a mock-up. They used the real airplane, and that is not a movie set. That's the Bell aircraft hangar at Edwards. The other star of the show was the Martin XB-51, renamed Gilbert XF-120. And this storyline was modeled after the F-100 that you see in the background, which had some major design modifications even after it went into service. This was part of the plot of the film. And it's a tremendous story between the relationship between General Banner, played by Lloyd Nolan on the left, and Lincoln Bond, played by William Holden. The movie has tons of action. It's all real footage. There's no it was before computer generated imagery. And so all the flying that you see in the movie is the real stuff. They have crash sequences. They have in-flight emergencies. And of course, General Banner and his attractive secretary, Connie Mitchell. But as the story unfolds, wait a minute, Connie Mitchell? How did they get a name like that? Oh, I see. Yeah, I thought so. As I was saying, the story involves Lincoln Bond making a comeback from having been a prisoner of war during the Korean conflict, and he's trying to prove himself as a test pilot. And there's a concern about General Banner flying the X-2 at his ripe old age of mid-50s. And so Lincoln Bond is devising a scheme to try and solve that problem. Lo and behold, he makes the one last flight in the X-2 before turning it over to the general, and winds up opening it up and taking it to its maximum performance. Now, in the movie, as he approaches Mach 3, the airplane tumbles out of control due to inertia coupling. They actually used the real footage from Chuck Yeager's X-1A tumble 3 years earlier. And thankfully, Bond activates the ejection system, as they say in the film, and survives the bailout, although he is injured, but proving that an older man would not have survived. Well, there were 3 premieres of the movie. There was the Buffalo, New York theater, where the Bell Aircraft plant was located. Here we see William Holden and Virginia Leith, who plays Connie, arriving at the base theater at Edwards Air Force Base for that premiere. But then there was the New York premiere, and William Holden appeared on a Sunday night TV show called What's My Line, where a panel of celebrity judges tries to guess who the personality is. They're all blindfolded. And it was a kind of an interesting show on same night as Ed Sullivan. This particular episode was aired on Sunday, September 23rd, 1956. And this is where William Holden was promoting the movie. Panelist Dorothy Kilgallen had interviewed him and recognized his voice and asked if he was in New York for the premiere of the film. Toward the Unknown made its New York movie premiere in Times Square on Thursday, September 27th, 1956. And you can look at that episode on YouTube, and you can see Holden talking about the movie opening on the 27th. Meanwhile, out at Edwards on the West Coast, the X-2 was really going through its paces. Captain Ivan Kinchlow, seen on the ladder, had flown the airplane to 126,000 feet on September 7th. And then Mel Abt was going to take the airplane to its maximum speed, making his first flight not only in a rocket airplane, but his first flight in the X-2. And so Mel was assigned to fly a profile and take the airplane out as far as he could. They launched early in the morning, 33,000 feet over Rosamond, California. This is the actual launch of Mel Apt's flight. Lieutenant Colonel Fitz Fulton was flying the B-50 mothership. And unexpectedly, Mel flew a perfect profile and wound up with 15 seconds extra engine burn as a result of that, and reached a speed of Mach 3.2, the first man to ever fly 3 times the speed of sound. He was at 70,000 feet, and the airplane was in stable flight for about 26 seconds. As he turned back toward the base, just like in the movie, the airplane tumbled out of control due to inertia coupling. Unlike the movie, sadly, Mel was lost in the accident. The date of that flight was Thursday, September 27th, 1956, the day the movie opened in New York. Our second story involves something I've talked about on the channel before, a trip that my father took to Miami from New York in 1956 on a brand new Eastern DC-7B Golden Falcon. And a souvenir he brought home from that trip was a stunning lithograph of a painting done by a Douglas artist, new Douglas artist at that time, named George Akamoto. And I was mesmerized by this, and the whole, just fascinated with the concept of someone working for an airplane company making paintings. And this image literally inspired my career. I became a Douglas artist in 1977, literally as a result of just being inspired by this beautiful image. Well, there's another saying: you should never meet your childhood heroes, because you'll probably be very disappointed. And for me, nothing could be further from the truth than this, because I got to meet and work with George Akamoto, who at that time was now the senior illustrator for the company. R.G. Smith was the chief artist. But let me share some beautiful images that George produced in the late 70s, early 80s. This is the DC-10 undergoing Cat 3 landing qualifications in weather. This is the launch of the Douglas World Cruisers in 1924 from Santa Monica. First flight around the world, took 6 months. He illustrated divider pages for the C-15 program proposal that went to the Pentagon. And portraits of airline presidents. This was always awarded to an airline president when he took delivery for the first time of a new Douglas airplane. This, of course, is Sir Freddie Laker. George also had outside projects. He did a lot of freelance work. One of those was the movie poster for the movie Hindenburg. Very talented artist and a lovely, lovely gentleman. Well, this was an illustration that George was working on for a double-page ad in Aviation Week showing all the Navy products made by McDonnell Douglas. And I'd been reading Aviation Week since I was a kid. And so this was really exciting to see this in action. But unbeknownst to me, I got a phone call in my office. I was the new kid in presentations, but I got a call from George and he asked me to come up to his office. He had a meeting to go to and this thing was due in the morning. He asked if I could please finish the last part of the illustration for him. And that was 2 airplanes that had to be inserted at the top, a missile firing Lockheed P-3 Orion and an F-18 Hornet. I was amazed. I mean, very honored, and I got to work right at his drawing board using his equipment and materials. And so I finished the 2 airplanes, and here was the completed illustration. We made the deadline, and here's the ad. Well, what's interesting is this is my first ever published artwork as a Douglas artist. And little could have I ever dreamed at age 9 when I first saw that DC-7 that I would be finishing an ad for George Okamoto and we'd have our work published in Aviation Week magazine. A great thrill. Now, speaking of the Hindenburg, nice segue, this leads to our third story. This is the airship. Here's your winning a bar bet question. Name the first aircraft to fly scheduled passenger service nonstop across the Atlantic. And I'm sure everybody's going to say the DC-7C or the 1649 Connie. Believe it or not, it was the Hindenburg in 1936 carrying passengers from the US over to Germany for the 1936 Olympics. In fact, American Airlines had DC-3 service from the Northeast to Lakehurst, New Jersey, and connecting directly with the Zeppelin, which then flew across the Atlantic. And I love the copy. It says, fly from New York to Berlin in the Olympics in less than 3 days, which, by the way, was half the time of the ocean voyage on a liner. Well, we covered Lufthansa and the Hindenburg and that whole story in a book by the great Ron Davies. I had illustrated a series of 15 of these books for Ron, and the Lufthansa book was our second in the series. It was the chapter on the Hindenburg and talked about the history of the airship. And this was the page that I illustrated. And you notice that normally we would compare an airplane to a 747 to show the size comparison. In this case, we used the Queen Mary because the Queen Mary is about 1,000 feet long, and this showed the Hindenburg at 804 feet. But I was working on this illustration, and I had the Zeppelin line drawing on my drawing board. The date happened to be January 10th, 1989. The book was published a year later. And this was a pretty intricate drawing. It had a lot of fine line detail. And I was working on the markings at that moment. And I always worked to music. I had an FM radio station playing at that time. And the news came up on the top of the hour. And the announcer said, broadcasting has lost a legend today with the passing of Herb Morrison. Herb Morrison is the gentleman you see on the left in this photograph. Now, if you don't recognize that name, you might recognize his claim to history. Herb Morrison was the voice of the broadcaster at Lakehurst, New Jersey, when the Hindenburg landed and the unfortunate accident in May of 1937 on its maiden voyage across the Atlantic for that season. Well, I was looking at this illustration on my drawing board and they played the recording of him. And when he got to the line, "Oh, the humanity," I just about lost it. My hand was shaking so bad I wasn't going to be drawing for the rest of the night. And I just turned off the light and walked out. But there were 45 profiles in the Lufthansa book. Why on that night was I working on the Hindenburg, listening to that radio? An amazing story. As mentioned, Ron and I worked on 15 of these books. He was literally a titan in the airline industry. He was the curator of air transport for the Smithsonian National Air and Space Museum. He and I had met at Douglas when in earlier years, he was an airline analyst, analyzing routes and city pairs for Douglas airplanes. But he illustrated all the maps in these books by hand. He was a tremendous cartographer and just an encyclopedic knowledge of aviation history and commercial aviation. It was really a joy to work with him and an honor. But these are some of the pages from these books. And as I said, Lufthansa was our second in a series of 15 titles. Our last story involves this photo, which, well, what do you think's going on here? A cigar and a pipe on an airplane, right? This is United Airlines Caravelle men-only executive flight. Try that today. But in the 50s, late 50s, early 60s, United had a men-only executive service between Chicago and New York using their new twin-jet French Caravelle. These airplanes were named after cities in France. They had 20 of them. And the load factors were 90 to 100%. These planes were packed. It was a very popular service. The way it worked is that at 9 in the morning and at 5 in the afternoon, a Caravelle would take off from both Chicago and New York, flying to the other city. And in this way, businessmen could literally leave in the morning, do business in one of those two cities and be home after dinner. And it was a novel approach, but the only woman on board was the stewardess. And yes, she handed out cigars and served drinks, and it was of another era. Well, as a teenager, I mentioned in earlier videos, I used to hang out at the airport on the weekends. I unfortunately had a kind of a crummy Kodak Brownie camera. Apologies for the low res photo here, but I was always taking pictures of airplanes, wintertime, summertime. And this is getting ready for a 5 o'clock departure on the men only service, United Caravelle at the terminal at Idlewild, as it was called back then. And you'll notice that, as I mentioned, each of the airplanes was named after a city in France. November 1012 uniform happened to be named Ville de Lille. I thought that was a pretty name. And so I made a drawing of this. This is my Prismacolor pencil phase. And I did a colored pencil drawing of this airplane. Let me introduce my dear friend, Jean-Louis Delazan. Jean-Louis owned a French restaurant in the early 90s. That's where he and I met, and we became good friends. And he shared a passion for airliners, and his favorite airliner of all time was the Concorde, because he saw this machine fly at the Paris Air Show when he was 10 years old. But the only thing better for Jean-Louis than seeing a Concorde was flying on it. And he's been on board, I believe, about a half a dozen times. Well, he was later in the travel industry and was associated with a company that chartered Air France Concordes for around the world trips. And I was fortunate enough to get involved with that company, and I illustrated a number of menu covers for those flights. And Jean-Louis and I shared a Concorde trip in January of 1998, trip of a lifetime, wonderful experience. This was, we had the whole airplane to ourselves. No, there were 75 passengers, and it was a trip. This particular charter was golf courses around the world. And so we had we flew to Paris and took the airplane from Paris to New York, and then New York to Miami on the first 2 legs of the round the world flight. We were allowed to walk around on the ramp, take pictures. This is why the airplane is referred to as the Beast. Quite a machine. Jean-Louis got the cockpit. He sat in what we call seat 0A, the jump seat for the transatlantic leg, and took this photo as the airplane was taxiing out for takeoff at Charles de Gaulle. This has to be one of, if not the best ever, name the plane contest shadow shots of all time. No doubt what you're flying in with this. About an hour and a half later, Jean-Louis took this photograph at about 60,000 feet, flying at Mach 2.04. And again, just trip of a lifetime, really great experience. Well, as a thank you, I gave Jean-Louis this drawing that I'd kept all those years. And his reaction to it was a surprise to me, because he just went silent and his eyes bugged out and he just couldn't believe what he was looking at. And it wasn't that the art was that great, but he saw the date, which I was always told to date my work. And so this was drawn on April 1st, 1963. And he then told me that he was born in the town of Lille, France. His birthday was March 31st, 1963, the day that I started this drawing. Certain aviation phenomena simply can't be explained. Now, you didn't think I was going to finish this without slipping in a model box top, did you? Well, this one's mine. It's a what if, but you never know. Revell S. Kit. So there you have it. 4 amazing aviation stories and coincidences. My thanks to the special people that helped make this presentation possible. And I hope you enjoyed this. We have more stories in the future and a lot of content coming up. If you haven't subscribed, please do. We'd love to have you on board, and always enjoy the comments. But thank you so much for celebrating aviation with Mike Machat. And as always, until next time, take care.